Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating. We're going to connect the 4-year-old French prodigy, the microscopic brain wiring of a tiny roundworm, and some cutting-edge AI algorithms from Stanford. Now you might be wondering, what do those three things possibly have in common? Well, we're putting them together to reveal exactly how our standardized linear institutions are fundamentally clashing with high-dimensional minds. So let's jump right in and look at the hard biological reality of how we actually learn, and why researchers are arguing that our standard systems are frankly failing to support it.
Okay, let's start with Section 1, the linear illusion.
To really understand this friction, the briefing document highlights a pretty heartbreaking case study of a 4-year-old gifted boy in Nice, France. Now imagine this kid. He had already mastered incredibly complex verb tenses, like the subjunctive, right? He had an extraordinary grasp of linguistic nuance and was already exhibiting reading and math skills comparable to a first grader. But in his nursery class, his teacher forced him to just sit there and perform menial tasks, like tracing dotted lines. And when his highly advanced mind couldn't engage with this overly basic, disconnected task, the teacher completely missed his intelligence. Instead, she stood in front of the entire class and labeled him as bad and incapable.
The source details the immediate, real-world consequences of this mismatch. Because the environment demanded this basic, step-by-step linear progression that just totally ignored his high-dimensional mind, the boy actually started hiding his flawless handwriting. He literally hid his reading and math abilities just to cope with being so profoundly misunderstood. He experienced what researchers call school shock, completely refusing to attend class until his parents finally intervened and moved him to an environment where he actually felt safe enough to show what he knew.
So, why does this happen? To answer that, we need to move to Section 2, staggered neural development.
To really get it, we have to zoom way out from the classroom to the hard biology of the brain. And we're going to look at some fascinating new research published in the journal Neuroscience. 302. That is the exact number of neurons in the C. elegans roundworm. Researchers used a specific algorithm called BigClam, which assigned these membership weights to figure out how neurons group together to map out these 302 neurons. Actually, scratch that, it's 302 neurons and over 7,000 synaptic connections. This is a massive breakthrough because C. elegans is literally the only animal with a fully mapped connectome. But they didn't just map the static structure, they actually tracked how these neural communities develop dynamically over 4 larval stages and into adulthood.
And what they discovered is a total game changer. These neural communities absolutely do not mature all at once in some synchronized, uniform way. Instead, functional circuits develop sequentially. In the very early stages, you only get basic survival behaviors, like pharyngeal regulation, which is basically just feeding and swallowing. Movement circuits, those come later. And the really complex behavioral circuits, like sleep-like quiescence, they don't even emerge until the very late stages of development.
This brings us to an absolutely crucial biological reality called asynchronous development. Basically, cognitive circuits mature at staggered intervals and highly specialized paces. A single neuron can even belong to multiple functional communities depending on its synapses. So, the big takeaway here is this. If a specific neural community isn't fully developed, learning simply cannot take place. You can't ask a brain that is currently only wired for walking to suddenly sit down and do advanced math. But conversely, and this is exactly what we saw with that little boy in France, you cannot force a brain that is perfectly wired for advanced math to sit and mindlessly trace dotted lines. Biology dictates a staggered, highly specialized timeline.
And that biological reality brings us to our next major hurdle in Section 3, institutional blindness.
We are looking at a massive structural mismatch here. On one side, we have our linear institutions. Think schools, corporate bureaucracies, right? They operate on one-dimensional, synchronized timelines. They demand low-bandwidth compliance. On the other side, we have staggered complexity. That's the biological reality of the high-dimensional, asynchronous mind. The research shows that our institutions operate basically like simple, linear processors. They completely lack the hardware to mentalize or map a network that is developing asynchronously. They literally cannot read the underlying logical code of a gifted mind.
Because these standard systems are so rigidly built for uniform growth, they inevitably default to what researchers call the medicalization of misunderstanding. When a high-potential individual's staggered development is out of sync with the standardized ruler, the institution doesn't see brilliance, it sees a problem. The research argues that these systems actually pathologize the complexity, frequently mislabeling this amazing asynchronous growth as a deficiency, a behavioral issue, or even clinical ADHD.
And forcing that kind of alignment causes real, structural, psychological harm. Let's move to Section 4, the geometry of stress.
Can an algorithm actually hear trauma before a human expert? That's the wild question behind a groundbreaking Stanford University study published in Nature Mental Health. The researchers tasked 4 advanced AI language models to listen to 1.5-hour recorded interviews of over 200 children aged 9 to 13. These kids were talking about stressful life events, and the researchers wanted to know if AI could predict future psychological breakdowns based on how they spoke.
The results here were just staggering. It turns out, the absolute strongest predictor of future anxiety or depression wasn't the actual traumatic events the children described. It was what the research highlights as the predictive power of C, specifically looking at connecting words. Words like and, but, and towards. Just think about that for a second. The specific geometric way a child connects their thoughts computationally predicted their future mental health better than the content of the trauma itself.
So why does this happen? Well, for an exceptionally gifted child trapped in a blind environment, these connecting words represent their linguistic scaffolding. When the people around them, teachers, institutions, society, don't understand their high-dimensional reality, the child is forced to constantly build these exhaustive verbal bridges just to keep a standard, one-dimensional system aligned with their complex logic. They're burning through their cognitive resources trying to translate their 4D world into a 1D format. And that constant structural repair work, it leaves a permanent, highly stressful mathematical signature right there in their speech.
This exposes a stark difference between human and algorithmic analysis. The AI language models actually outperformed highly experienced human psychologists. Why? Because the humans compress these rich, hour-and-a-half-long narratives into flat, arbitrary clinical scores. They were basically throwing away the underlying structural data. The AI, on the other hand, acted as a precise eavesdropper. It completely bypassed human biases, looked directly at the microstructures of the language, and read the cognitive friction that was literally hard-coded into the geometry of the kids' sentences.
Okay, so where do we go from here? Let's wrap things up in Section 5, Rethinking Cognitive Growth.
Let's synthesize our essential takeaways for this explainer. First, we absolutely have to respect the biology. Neural maturity is an asynchronous, staggered process, not a straight line. Second, we have to stop allowing linear institutions to pathologize complex cognitive growth simply because it doesn't fit neatly on a standardized timeline. Third, we now have hard mathematical proof from AI that this structural exclusion causes deep, measurable linguistic stress. We have to realize that when an environment forces a child to spend all their metabolic energy just defending their cognitive autonomy, it robs them of the ability to actually learn. We literally must adapt our systems to the highly specialized, out-of-sync circuits of the minds they're supposed to serve. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought today. If our artificial intelligence algorithms can precisely eavesdrop on the hidden geometry of childhood stress, when will our human institutions finally abandon their rigid timelines and start listening to the brilliant, asynchronous logic of the minds they actually serve? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and as always, never stop learning.